Um, I'll try to keep it short. This is usually a 1 hour talk. And roughly, I'd like to cover three things. The first two will go very fast, like within 5 minutes. And most of my time I'll spend on the third one. So first, I'll talk a little bit about Scrum. Who here is familiar with Scrum? Okay, almost everyone. Good. I'll talk a little bit about LeSS. And then the majority of this talk will be about why did we ended up creating LeSS. So kind of the creation story of LeSS. So first, Scrum. Most people, when they see Scrum, when they think about Scrum, they think about a diagram like this. And this diagram does represent Scrum. It's not wrong. It just, to me, shares the uninteresting parts of Scrum. And there's many different perspectives of Scrum. This one, to me, is a much better and more interesting explanation of Scrum. It is about teams, which we set free. We'll let them self-manage and self-organize. And the teams are cross-functional, and they build things incrementally, iteratively. But when we think about, so LeSS is, LeSS originally meant large-scale Scrum. So when we think about using Scrum with multiple teams, we'll first need to start off with the essence of Scrum. Sorry, I'm putting it too close by. And the essence of Scrum is kind of similar as Alistair explained. I always like to explain the essence of Scrum with this really simple idea where we're getting a cross-functional team, we'll get them together, we'll let them talk with a customer. Together they decide what is the most important thing to build. They go off and build it, then they stop. They share what they build with the customer. They talk about how they build it. They decide what to build next. They build it, they stop, etc., etc. And that's basically it. And unfortunately, that essence is kind of lost with the meetings and events and techniques. So when we think about scaling Scrum, we need to not so much think about scaling meetings, roles, etc. I mean, we do need to do that, but it's not so important. But it's much more important to try to figure out how we can keep that essence when we're in a large organization and we have multiple teams. So that was point one already. Point two, LeSS. And LeSS is similar as Scrum in that sense. Most people, when they see LeSS or think about LeSS, then they will think about this diagram. And this diagram, just like the Scrum one, it's probably necessary, but it's not very interesting. So I'll run through it very briefly and give you a quick 2-minute introduction to LeSS. So LeSS starts off with the product owner role. There's one per product, not one per team. From a LeSS perspective, having a product owner per team is a terrible mistake. Then there's one product backlog per product. There's one sprint with multiple teams working in one sprint. There's a sprint starts with a shared sprint planning one, where each of the teams decide what they are going to work on during this sprint. And then after that, each team independently, although usually in what in LeSS is called a multi-team fashion, they'll do sprint planning part 2, where they split the work so that they can work as a team. Each of the teams work in the same sprint. Halfway the sprint, they stop for backlog refinement, where they look 1-2 sprints ahead. At the end of the sprint, they show one integrated product. The teams have their individual retrospectives. And then the only different thing between Scrum and LeSS is the added event of an overall retrospective, where we get management, Scrum Masters, team members, product owner, to talk about systemic organizational problems. And that's basically it. There's not much more to it. And now, here we go. That was let's see if I squeezed that in 5 minutes. 4, pretty good. So that was the basic, uninteresting part of this talk. You passed, congratulations for that. Let me talk a little bit more of what this talk originates from. So this talk originates out of another talk I did a couple years ago in the Agile Singapore conference. So I live in Singapore. It's a long flight from here. And I did a typical talk about a scaling framework. So I talked about the things you just said, but then stretched it to 20 minutes. Talked about how do you do these events and things like that. And at the end, I thought it was pretty good. I think they videoed it, so you can still find that. And then I asked my colleague from China, Louis, I asked him, so what did you think about it? And he stopped for a moment and he said, I think it was boring. And I was shocked, but that's why I always ask him, because he'll not polish the answer. And then he said to me, don't worry, every talk about a framework will be boring. And that sounded like a challenge to me. So I thought about how can I make a talk about a framework that is not boring, but that's interesting. So I thought about interesting talks that I've seen, and one of the things that's common is storytelling. So therefore, the rest of the 40 minutes, I'll just be sharing stories on how we completely accidentally ended up creating less. And I'll start with a sidetrack story. Can anyone guess? Absolutely. So this is my son, as you can see, a by now old photo. And as you can see, a huge Star Wars fan, of course. And I'd like to start off with a story about him, which seems unrelated, but in retrospect is surprisingly useful and related. And this is a couple years ago. In Singapore, we were driving back from his swimming lesson. So I'm originally Dutch, and for Dutch people, learning to swim is important. So we're driving back from his swimming lesson, and we got stuck in traffic. And he's sitting in the back, and he's annoyed, and he's looking at the traffic and looking at me. And suddenly he says, "Papa, I want to go faster." And I tell him, well, that's very nice, but we're stuck in traffic, right? So we can't go any faster. And then he looks around and he noticed that on the other side of the road, there's no traffic and the cars are going very fast. So he's pointing to the other side of the road and says, but they are going faster. So I said to him, yes, that's true, but they're going in the wrong direction. Right? We have a choice here. We can either go in the right direction a little bit slower, or we can go in the wrong direction much faster. What do you want? So you said, I want to go in the wrong direction much faster. And at that time, I just thought it was funny. But then the next day, I woke up. And then I realized that this was probably a perfect analogy to most companies that I work with. Because most companies, when I go there, they're obsessed about things like productivity and velocity. And they're not wondering whether they're going in the right direction in the first place. And one of the things that we don't care about, and I thanks Alistair for pointing out Jeff Sutherland's horrible book. I'll acknowledge that. Please do not bother reading that. We are not so interested in going very fast, but much more interested in having all the people go in the right direction. So, the story about LeSS. The story about LeSS is originated from me working in a company called Nokia. And we build things like this, not the phone side, the network side, the part that is now still called Nokia. And I was living and working in China in around, 2004 or so. And at that point, Nokia decided that they want to do agile development. Although they didn't know what it was. So they looked for somebody who had experience with agile development, and they found me. I don't claim to be the only one. I claim to be the only foundable one. They asked me, would you help us with adopting agile development? And I had said yes to that question before they told me that I had to go to Helsinki, Finland. And any people from Finland? Okay, for other people, don't go there. It is very cold. There's a reason I live in Singapore now. So I moved to Finland, and I discovered that there's no management mandate whatsoever. We were buried somewhere in the organization, and they had no idea what agile development was. They just wanted to try that out. So we ended up, let's see if that's the next slide. Yes, we ended up working with this person, a friend of mine now, Lahrman, the co-creator of LeSS. And we ended up working with him because he had written this book. And this book was published around that time, and it was kind of a summary of everything agile development, without ever going deep into any of the topics. And that was perfect for an organization that doesn't know what they want. So we started working with them, and we started giving this one-day introduction to agile development. And unfortunately, they were very successful. And the effect of that was that lots of different products wanted to start adopting agile development, or specifically Scrum, all at the same time, without any support whatsoever. There was 1.5 coach supporting 10 different products wanting to adopt Scrum. Second problem, none of those products consisted of one team. Right? In Nokia Networks, the smallest product had about 3 teams. The largest products had, nobody knew how many teams there were. There were just a lot of teams. So therefore, in order to, let me see, I'm not used to these stupid handheld mics. There we go. So in order to survive, the only thing that we could do was do lots and lots of experiments. So what both me and Craig would do, we would go to one of these products, and first we would spend 1 or a couple days pair programming with the developers to get some sense of what was really going on there. And then we would have this typically one-day event where management, developers, product management would all get together, and we would basically just try to understand what the problems were that they were having, mostly using techniques like systems thinking and systems modeling. We tried to understand the problems that they had, and then together we would come up with an experiment. And they would do the experiment, and we would go to the next product, pair program a bit with the developers, get all the people together, come up with an experiment. So try to understand their problems, come up with an experiment. They would go and try that, and we would go to the next. And so for about 2 years or so, we just did lots and lots of experiments with different product groups in parallel. And some of these experiments were terrible and failed miserably. And some of them ended up being now what we call LeSS. Now, in order to decide what we can in order to be, let me turn that sentence around. The biggest influence, or some of the influences for the experiments, were first retrospective of existing products. So these two books, now hard to get and out of print, I guess, they're kind of a summary of important development product, and then it shares kind of what they did. So the first one, debugging the development process, is a retrospective of the Microsoft Excel version 1, which is clearly a very successful product. And the second one, Dynamics of Software Development, is a retrospective of the first Visual C++ product. So both very successful, influential products. So we learned about those, and Lean was a very important influence for the experiments. At this time, I believe the Toyota Way just was published when we started. The Lean Manager wasn't published yet, but later we got a lot of, especially the management side on LeSS, strongly influenced by that. And probably the most important one, in my opinion, is workplace management, which is not that commonly read, I'm afraid, but it's perhaps one of the best books. It's very little, contains lots of snippets of wisdom. And I always like it. It's not officially a Lean book, but Koru Ishikawa's What is Quality Control is a wonderful book about well, different ways of thinking about quality. I'll keep it with that. And also then, one other influence was this paper, Extreme Programming and Large Distributed Systems, from even Andre Carlson and Anderson. And this was published in one of the very early XP conferences. And this was from Ericsson. And Ericsson was kind of the #1 competitor of Nokia. So when they started publishing articles about how they adopted extreme programming to, in this case, AXC, their base station development, we were paying lots of attention. And one of the main things that we discovered is that, especially in dynamics of software development, combining with a lean view of inventory, handoff, a flow, combining with this led us to one of the now essential parts of LeSS, which we refer to as component team versus feature teams. Who here is familiar with component team versus feature teams? Okay, good. So this is probably one of the earliest impactful changes in your LeSS adoption. And what I'll do very briefly is I'll go off and talk a little bit about component teams, the problems that they create. Then I'll talk about feature teams, the problems that they create, and then I'll try to briefly explain why the problems of feature teams are better problems than the problems of component teams, because there's no structural solution that will solve all of your problems. Do you think if I go down there, I'm very uncomfortable standing up here. Do you think if I go down there, this mic will start interfering with the speakers?
Experiment, do an experiment.
Yeah, well, Feel Fast is too late already, because, so everyone, pay attention to your ears. It worked. Oh, this is so much better over here. And yeah, I'm not going to go back up there again, except that my remote is there. So, very briefly, thank you. So very briefly, let's just create a component team, and let's just create some component teams. So let me take these 4 people. You mind being in one team? Good. And we'll take these 4 people. They're later. I'll move them around. Don't tell them yet. So it's good that they're here up front. So we'll make them into a team also. And typically, component teams means that you organize your organization around your technology. So the most typical example is we have here the front-end team and there the back-end team. Do you mind being a back-end team? Good. Now, this leads to a couple of problems. Of course, the first problem is that, unfortunately, our customers do not request features that only depend on front-end work or back-end work. Annoying customers. It would be much easier if they would simply look at our architecture and decide what features they would like to have. But unfortunately, they don't do that. And therefore, for building some value, we need some front-end work and some back-end work. Now, if the customers would only make sure that the features that they would request would balance out the amount of front-end work and the amount of back-end work, then life would be a lot easier. But they don't do that either. So instead, first they request lots of features that require much front-end work and less back-end work. And after that, they'll go and request lots of features that require a lot of back-end work and not a lot of front-end work. So what happens now is that the front-end team is working on the highest priority, most important features, and the back-end team is not, because from their perspective, the highest priority for them is not the highest priority for the customer. So what they will do is they will work on, well, first, before I get there, so the problem we have here, of course, is dependencies between teams. And for years, I thought dependencies between teams is the main problem to solve when you're scaling agile development. And that's what all the other scaling frameworks still seem to think. And I've realized I was wrong, because dependencies between teams is not a problem. But a specific type of dependency is a problem, and that's what's happening now. Because what will happen is that this backend team will work on backend features, but in order to release them, they need some work from the front-end team. But the front-end team will not work on it yet, because from their perspective, they got more important features to work on. And from a lean perspective, what starts happening is we start creating queues between those teams, and because of the asynchronousness of the different features, these queues start filling up, creating inventory, and all of the problems of inventory, hiding defects, slowing lead time, etc., will happen because of that. So what will happen is that they finish their part of a feature, put it in a queue, and a couple of sprints later, this team will work on their part of that feature. They will try to integrate it with this team, and of course that will never work. So then the front-end team starts interrupting the back-end team, and the back-end team will be annoyed by that because they're working on something else right now. I'm sure most of you have actually experienced this dynamic, so I probably don't need to explain it much further. But the key problem here is that the dependencies between the teams are what we refer to as asynchronous dependencies. Right? The dependencies don't happen at the same time. And asynchronous dependencies between teams is a problem. To put it in Alistair's words, asynchronous dependencies between teams avoid the teams to collaborate with each other because they're focusing on different things at different times. So, you gave a remote, right? Yes, there we go. In the early papers and the early books, one of the things that came back over and over again was first daily builds or continuous integration as it evolved later, but also the concept of feature teams. And feature teams means we're structuring our teams not around technology. We're decoupling the team structure with the architecture. And instead, we're structuring our teams around customers. So usually making a feature team is very easy, so let me just do that. At least it's easy to show and explain. It's not easy when you work in organizations. Let me take, can you two move to here? Can you two move to there? And in LeSS, we encourage long-lived permanent teams. Don't move back anymore today. So now we have two teams, and in both of the teams we have some front-end and back-end knowledge, and here we have some front-end and back-end knowledge. So now we can take a customer feature and we can give it to the team, and there's no more dependencies between the teams. We can take another feature, give them to this team, etc., etc., etc. Now, of course, it's not as easy as that, because we do have dependencies, but now the dependencies relate to the teams working in the shared code. Right? So the backend people of this team and the backend people of that team work on the backend at the same time, even though they're not within the same team. Now, first, this problem is a solvable problem. In fact, you know, the shared code ownership shared code ownership inside the team was one of the early agile practices, and we're only scaling that up across multiple teams. Second, one of the things that happens is that the dependencies between the teams now are what we refer to as synchronous dependencies. So if this team needs to change a class in the backend and that team needs to change a class in the backend, then they'll need to change it at the same time. And because they're changing it at the same time, suddenly there's a benefit of the teams to actually collaborate and work together. This team can actually cross-team pair program with the other team on some functionality that they can both use. I need to get up here, unfortunately. So we started off with changing organizations from component to feature teams. And it worked really well, first with 3 team products and with 5 team products, later with hundreds of team products. And it didn't matter what scale you used it, it always worked well. It worked well for what now we refer to as accidental specialization, that even though we decoupled the teams from the architecture, because the teams tend to work on similar features, therefore they accidentally specialize in part of the system. So about 2 years Finland, about 2 years experimenting, and then after that I had enough of Finland. I moved back to China, later to Singapore. And Craig said to me, let's write a book. And at this point, I didn't know the answer should be no. It's very painful. So I said yes. And we made a catalog of our experiments. We ended up with 2 of them. And there's literally 1,000 experiments, each formed in try or avoid. So try meant we were working in this context. We tried out this. It worked. Maybe it will work for you too. And avoid was, we were working in this context. We had this problem. We tried out this. It didn't work for us. No guarantee that it will not work for you, but it didn't work for us. Then, thanks for shortening my presentation. This is, saves me 2 minutes or so. Then one of the feedback we got was that people liked the book, but they didn't know very much what to do with it, because there was so much stuff. And at no point did it say, well, you must do this, this, and this, and this. So first we declared the people who gave the feedback stupid. Then we realized that's not the right approach to feedback. And then we started trying to figure out what happened. And looking at the Shu-Ha-Ri model, that helped us explain what had happened. Because what had happened was we had written the books for us. We had written the books for high-level people, and people who wanted to know about scaling read them, and they were like, wow, now I have lots of ideas, but I don't know what to do with that. So we went back and we had this problem, kind of the same problem as Alistair just described, which is there's a reason why we didn't have any rules or told people what to do, or why we didn't have any framework. Like the last thing that I wanted to do in my life is create a scaling framework. I failed with that, unfortunately. And the problem is that once you give people rules, they start following them. And they stop thinking by themselves. And we didn't want that. We want people to go and experiment and try things out. But then, if you don't give them rules, then they don't start. And if they don't start, they can't experiment. Right? So we had this problem where, should we give them some rules, or should we just leave it open and give them lots of ideas? And eventually we realized this problem has been solved already. And that is, it's been solved in Scrum. Because if you think about Scrum, it provides a lot of prescription, but the prescription that it creates is about the points where it creates feedback. And therefore, once you follow the prescription, you can get feedback. And using that feedback, you can take more ownership and start doing experimentation. So therefore, we knew what to do next, which was we extracted the rules out of our experiments. We asked which experiments were so essential that all agile adoptions, in our opinion, ought to do that. Feature teams being an example of that. And we do want to have the less amount of rules, the fewest rules possible, because more rules we would take over the ownership from the teams. But the rules need to provide the prescription around the feedback points so that the teams can take that ownership. So we ended up with 2 pages of rules for groups of maximum 8 teams, and 1 additional page for if you scale up beyond 8 to the largest LeSS adoption we're aware of had 6,000 people. And you don't want 6,000 people working on one product. So we ended up writing a 3rd book, this one, which is kind of the prequel to the other ones, the more shoe-level book, which it explains the rules and tends to explain what happens to organizations once you start adopting those rules. And as last part, we decided to create principles. Lean thinking, one of the LeSS principles. And this is kind of weird because normally you start with principles and you create experiments from the principles. But we did it the other way around. We started with the experiments, and then retrospectively we asked, in the successful experiments, which principles did we follow? And we ended up with these 10 principles. And I'd like to, as last thing for this talk, I'd like to highlight one of them. First, let me correct Alistair. In LeSS, we never say less is more. Instead, we use the principle more with less, which is basically the same sentence as you put on your slide. Before I end up with explaining the more with less principle, so I'd like to first close this part of the talk, where as a summary, LeSS is kind of, this is what we call the less complete picture, the overview picture of LeSS. LeSS is the experiments and the 3 pages of rules, together with the principles, together with the guides that explain what happens to organizations if you start adopting these rules. And then we got the same view as in Scrum, whereas LeSS isn't just the framework picture, but it is the experimental mindset. It is the flow picture. It is structural, organizational. LeSS kind of mandates organizational structural changes. It is doing experiments. It's the more with less principle. And it is trying to get self-organization, self-managing teams to work beyond one team. Now, as last thing, I'd like to go to the more with less principle. And I start off with this quote. Alistair, I believe this is from one of your, you used to call one of your favorite books. Do you remember that?
Which one?
This quote. So this is a quote from a book called Balancing Agility with Discipline, which is, don't write it down. I wouldn't recommend reading it. I don't, sorry?
It is not one of my favorite books.
Good. Neither is it mine. So don't write it down. It's not recommended. But it's an interesting book because of one of the authors. So one of the authors is a guy called Barry Beam. Barry Beam, very influential in our industry, worked there for, I think, 70 years now or so. And if you trace back the history of waterfall development, you tend to end up with Barry Beam. So he's perhaps secretly the father of waterfall, although he would never admit that, writing a book about agile development. And that's what makes it interesting. Because first, if you read it, you'll notice he doesn't understand it. But he does have this very traditional view trying to explain that. And because of that traditional view, every now and then he comes with this huge insight. And one of those is this one, build your method up, don't tailor it down. Where he said, you know, one of the things that we, large products, large organizations, need to learn from agile development is that traditionally we create these huge, complicated processes and methodologies, and then we give them to organizations, and then we say, don't worry, you don't need to use all of that. You just need to tailor it down. You need to remove the parts that you don't need. And Barry Beam concluded, that's a mistake. I'll clarify in a moment why. Instead, you need to start with this minimum core. In early agile development, people talked about barely sufficient. You need to start with that minimum core, give that to an organization, and then you basically say, you never need to remove from that, but if you're in pain, and only when you're in pain, you can add to that. But you never, ever have to remove from that. Unfortunately, the agile community has forgotten about the benefit of the agile community early on. But that's a different talk. So why? Why does tailoring down not work? I think all of you have actually experienced that, I'm pretty sure. But to make that concrete, usually once you start adopting a new process or methodology, at that point you build a new product for a new customer with new technology, with new people, etc. So what amount of information do you have to make this decision? Right? So what happens in organizations is we have this large process, and somebody is reading that and ask the question, in our particular context, do we need, say, a release train conductor? Right? Well, we don't really know. So let's keep it. Right? Let's keep it just to play safe. Right? And what happens is that organizations end up with more processes, more roles, and more artifacts than they actually need within that situation. And this is the key of the more with less principles. most organizations think that more processes or roles don't cause any harm. But the more with less principle is about realizing the harm that additional processes and roles cause in organizations. And therefore, you need to prevent that as much as possible. And just to be clear, it doesn't mean no roles or processes. You need some minimum, but you need to be careful not to go beyond that. Now let me explain each three of those in a bit more detail. More roles. So a role in an organization is a set of responsibilities that I assign to a single person. However, whenever you create a new role in an organization, usually you don't invent those responsibilities. Instead, you take the responsibilities. Yes, I've seen it. You take the responsibilities from somewhere and assign it to a particular person. So if we think about product development, when you create a new role, where do we take the responsibilities away from? Usually from the teams. So therefore, the more roles you create, the less responsibility you have within your teams, the less responsible teams. Right? Processes mostly refers to outside processes given to a team. The more outside processes you give to the team, the more you tell them how they should solve problems, the less ownership that team has for their way of working. And if the team has no ownership, you will not get any continuous improvement. You will not get any Kaizen. In order to get people to think about how to improve their work, they need to own their work. And in order to own their work, they need to be the ones that control their processes of how they work. So more outside processes forced on top of a team, less ownership, less continuous improvement. Now, the more artifacts we tend to create, artifacts tend to end up between the customer and the team. So more artifacts tend to lead to a bigger distance from the team to the customer, and it tends to lead to less customer-centric teams. So the more with less principle is this realization, the realization that we want less roles because we want more responsibility in the teams. We want more responsible teams. We want less processes because we want more ownership, because we're trying to create an organization where the teams is continuously improving their own work. And we want less artifacts because we want more customer-centric teams. We want the teams to work ideally directly with the customers to understand the domain and clarify the functionality they're going to build. So that's the more with less principle. It's also one of the reasons why less is hard to adopt, because for most things that you adopt in organizations, you can add new things to your organization. But usually when you adopt less to an organization, it usually leads to removing things from an organization. Right? The basis assumption behind that is that if we want agility, if we want not twice the amount of whatever in half the time, but we want flexibility and focus on the right direction, focus on value delivery, then we don't get that through more processes, but we get that through simpler organizations. Simpler organizations are more flexible organizations. Complex organizations will be slow. Right? So therefore, more with less focuses on removing complexity out of organizations to try to create simpler organizations, more agile organizations.